Good morning. You may hear a little background music. This is irisculp, and we'll be starting in 1 minute. So if you want to grab some coffee, some lunch, something to drink, you can just sit back and relax and enjoy. And we will, it's 11:29 Central Time. We'll start in a minute. And in the meantime, there is a chat feature on the right. If you are comfortable, you can just pop in and tell me your initials and maybe what state you're from. And we'll get started here very, very shortly. Thank you. Okay, we are at the beginning point. So welcome and thank you for joining this afternoon. Let me do just a couple of housekeeping kind of items and introduce myself. This session will last roughly an hour. I do add about 10 minutes on if people want to stay and do kind of a Q&A. Excuse me. I've been drinking some Coke this morning. Well, it caught in my throat. So it'll last an hour and 10 minutes extra if anybody wishes to do so. My name is irisculp, and I work with Lotus Travel with different heritage programs. My background, I've worked with them for about 6 years, and my background is actually in human resources and adult education. I have a master's in that, an undergrad degree in communications, and I've worked in communications, writing, human resource, and project management for about 18 years prior to my husband and I adopting our two great kids who are now 12 and 14, and have just kind of gotten involved in this work through the passion of talking about adoption, China, as well as just interest in some professional work and travel as well, having worked for both American Airlines and Sabre, as well as in healthcare and education. So the company is owned by Leah Yu and Louis Yi, who started in 1995. So let's just dive in. This is a pretty educational seminar. We really focus on answering some real general questions and then going and delving a little more deeply into how to leverage the trip for the highest positive impact for yourself and your children. And we pull in some research as well as just some practical, you might say, angles in order to make that 2 or 3 week experience, which is kind of the, you might say, the default norm, into being a really high impact, identity building, positive cultural component for your kids to kind of navigate their lives. So we know it's not just the exotic international vacation. And that's a lot of what kind of the meat of this seminar goes into, which we will get to roughly maybe half to 2/3 of the way into the session today. If you do have questions, feel free, or if there's something I'm saying that's not clear, feel free to pop that up in the chat session. If you do have more of an in-depth question, I would request that we save it to the Q&A, just because I can easily get off track, and I don't want to do that. I do want to cover the key components of what we have on the agenda today. So with that said, let me kick off and get into some of the content here. Okay, the next slide, and I do this and then I do a little disclaimer. This is actually my youngest daughter in Guangzhou, just outside the U.S. consulate. So since I get to do this, I get to throw in a slide that I like. This is my favorite picture from that adoption trip, mostly because she cried most of the 5 days in her province, and we got to Guangzhou and finally saw a smile. But Lotus Travel has been around for, as I said earlier, about 20 years, and have handled a lot of adoptions and have networks throughout all of China. So what are some of those things that make a heritage trip? And I'm going to use that term in a pretty generic way. Sometimes people say a heritage trip is only when you go visit an orphanage. I'm referring to it in this seminar really as any trip back to birth country, whether it's a first trip back, 10th trip back, any of that. But what makes it unique? Of course, it's not just the cool exotic trip that your friends might think or extended relatives. It's really connecting as a whole family, that your identity has probably been affected as a transracial family now, and connecting your whole family to that important cultural component. So there is often, but not always, an orphanage visit or a foster family visit, and sometimes the connection is just the physical place as well. Now, just a real brief research piece here, and that is I'd like to go into talk about very briefly the massive study done in 2007 by the Evan B. Donaldson Institute looking at transracial adoptees and experiences. And basically, out of that massive study, about 3 key components came forward, and it ended up being called, quote, Beyond Culture Camp. And the main point was, yeah, culture camps are great, but they're not the end all to be all. And the reason is they're not normal lived experiences. They are weekends or week-long or 2-week-long experiences that usually are interesting but pretty structured in terms of classes and kind of have a limit to the impact. So it's a good starting place. But these 3 points were brought up as kind of the next step to help that cultural connection really, really deepen. So the lived experiences included birth country visits. Obviously, that's why that's quoted here. Racially diverse schools, and then having regular racial role models in their life, not just people they would see at camp and so forth. So what I think is a little bit stunning is that first stat, where 78% of adoptees wish to be white, and that is a bit of a two-edged sword, if you will. One general interpretation can be seen in a very positive light, that most of the parents are Caucasian, and they're living in a sometimes Caucasian dominated society, and they want to be similar to their parents. It also underscores the importance of what we as parents need to do and think about in terms of those role models and experiences to provide. So, okay, other research, and this actually comes from a PhD dissertation and is encapsulated in a book that I'll mention a couple of times probably, called From Home to Homeland. And that book follows several families that have traveled and kind of pulls out some trends. It also includes It's really a compilation as a book of different travelers' experiences, some parents, some kids, some professionals. But the research piece of the book is one of the 25 or so chapters. It's pretty short and basically says these three key findings come out of most heritage trips. There tends to be an increased interest in both the culture and the language. There's a confidence level that emerges, such as, and I can certainly speak to it from a personal observation standpoint, and it is also consistent from the feedback that we hear from adoptive families returning from a first heritage trip. And that is, some people say, well, my child was just more comfortable in her own skin, kind of thing, or she could kind of let go of some fears or questions, even though, a lot of questions still remained unanswered. My oldest was 7 at the time of the first return trip, and she came back. Yeah, she was 7, and she came back and was talking in her Montessori school about pointing it out to one of the teacher's aides as I happened to be walking in. She said, "Yes, this part, looking at the world map, or I think it was actually a geography puzzle board, is China, and here you can see the Great Wall because it had that relief thing on it." And she said, "And I have climbed the Great Wall," and she kind of had her hands on her hips and spoke in a very kind of cool way to see. Now, the other thing to keep in mind is that parents and kids do sometimes have different needs on a trip and different expectations, and we will come back to that. So that's good just to be cognizant of and prepare for it as well. So a heritage trip is generally, it's not it's Tuesday, so we're seeing the Bund in Shanghai and at 2, and then we're seeing this at 4, and blah, blah, blah. There are some certain elements of cultural icons that we do include, but it's also more paced for a family. It's got a real kid-friendly focus with hands-on experiential activities, relationship focus with possibly a visit to an orphanage. So it's kind of built for families' needs. Now, a real common question that comes in is really the typical start one, which is, okay, what age ideally should my child be? And that is, of course, the juggernaut, because then all other issues kind of revolve around that in terms of planning. The prevailing wisdom used to somewhat be, when they're teens, they'll be old enough to appreciate it, and so on and so forth. But it's really kind of shifted to saying early or pre-adolescence. And there is an article that I'll send out after the seminar today, written by Dr. Rebecca Nelson, who herself is a transracial adoptee from Korea, as well as a child psychologist. And to quote her, she says, quote, "Multiple visits across a lifespan is ideal." And that's great. Not all of us live in the ideal world. So if people say, okay, let's try to narrow it down to maybe one best time to go. Generally, it's that early elementary age, 8, 9, 10, 11, maybe, possibly 12, depending on, now, not saying there's really a bad time to go or that you shouldn't go at other times, but there are some key advantages to that time if you want to consider them. And each parent knows their own child, so there is no hard and fast rule, as we all know in parenting. But at that age, they're old enough to kind of navigate the rigors of travel. They still like to be seen with you, or let's put it this way, they don't mind being seen with you. And I can say that as a parent of a 14-year-old right now. And they tend to also look to you more than their peer group to help kind of sort out important experiences, or look to you for clarification and support in those ways. And that can be really a key plus as well during a trip like this. Advanced planning I generally say about a year in advance. Really anywhere from 6 to 18 months works, but a year kind of is just a nice default. Quite honestly, picking the time you plan to go and who you're going to bring with is probably the biggest hurdle, particularly initially. And then sometimes I say you might consider grandparents or godparents or extended family. We took my kids' godparents on that initial trip, and that was really insightful, particularly for them. Seeing, and we kind of had to blend a little bit of things they wanted to do that weren't on our bucket list, so to speak, but it worked out really quite well. So let's talk a little bit about seasons, and there are some real practical considerations to this piece as well. Generally, spring has beautiful weather. It tends to be one of my favorite, one of my top two. It's got great weather. If you travel before April 1st, if that works with the spring break schedule, perhaps your air tickets sometimes are a bit more well priced in terms of that. Summer, of course, is the good default for kids' schedules. Fall has great weather. In China, there's a lot of Chinese travelers traveling during the fall period, so you tend to run into more Chinese tourists, families traveling for National Day and holidays and those things. So it's generally not the best, and the prices tend to be more particular for the in-country. And then winter is usually the lowest cost on airfare. So those are just some considerations. So heritage tour options, I like to talk about this. There's, you might say, a standard tour, group tour you can see on a website, and then specialized tours. We do these all the time, or trips. You can write us with a list and say, we want to see this city, this city, this city. We want to spend 4 days here, 3 days here, yada, yada. And that can be, say, a private family, or get some of your friends together, whether travel group or other friends, and create your own. And that obviously has a lot of pluses. Some people say, hey, no one we know is going to go to our time frame that we really want to do. So they join kind of a standard tour and then split off for their own private family time. And that has some cost advantages, as well as just the advantage of your child being with other kids, that don't really have to explain what an orphanage visit is and a finding spot, and any of those if you choose to do that. So those are some things. Cost considerations. Let me say just up front, kind of a real generic ballpark, you might say base price cost for a 2-ish week trip. Generally, that's per adult about $2,000. Some of them will be $17.99, $18.99. Some will be $23.99. Some of that is, just factoring in exactly how many days are on that list and so forth. But you could say $2,000 per adult. Kids, for purposes of travel, are considered adult once they reach 12 and older, eat like adult, take up space kind of like an adult, etc. So if your child's under 12, then you can figure 20% off of that $2,000. Does not include international airfare. Sorry to say, that is its own little animal that, if you want for great deals, sometimes the price can double or half, depending on your particular scenario, and what you find will certainly help you if you're interested in that, or you can shop it on your own or use miles. The other cost considerations can be if there's more than 10 adults in your group, particularly if you're putting a group together, then you get the best price break on hotels, entrance fees, and so on. Hotel accommodation levels are key. Usually we book at what's called deluxe or 4-star, typical as you probably had on the adoption trip. Usually a really nice lobby, concierge, possibly an indoor swimming pool, the things that are not necessarily real typical for a Chinese traveler. So pretty comfy. Now, transport mode, if you're flying to every location in China, that can add. We usually do try to include at least one train trip probably more for the experience, or really probably for both, the benefit of the experience itself, particularly for the kids, and that it also holds the cost budget in line with cutting out one night a hotel if it's a sleeper train, and it's generally a less expensive way to go than air travel. So talk time all the time is kind of my mantra. You can talk on a regular basis about things you're going to be doing and be involved in. You can look at itineraries. You can get some off our website, the internet, and just request a brochure, cut it up, paste it in, and discuss that with your kids. Share control would be my recommendation. Where do you want to go? This is what's on the agenda. Are you going to be sticking to an exact agenda? Or are you going to vary some things in there? So just kind of get it out and discuss it in terms of showing pictures of the places you plan to visit. Google Earth is awesome. You can literally look up the address of your hotel, maybe the orphanage, and do a Google Earth search and find out some stunning stuff. Those kind of things help it move from this abstract idea to, oh my gosh, in 3 months or next summer, whatever, we're going to be there. You can also do some things like practical preparations. If you live in a, say, suburban area or a small town, you can talk about the differences in population, because if you're going to be, the town I live in is a third of a million or so pretty small, and by certainly China standards, very, very small. So if you're visiting, Beijing, Guangzhou, that's what, 16 million and 17 million. My daughter's capital city, I'll never forget, on the adoption trip was described it. Yes, Kunming is a small town. It's only 4.5 million. So you can talk about some of those things and some of those differences that you'll encounter. And it even goes into, my kids were young enough that I actually initially just said, okay, I told them the number, not it mattered, especially at their ages. There's 1.4 billion people in China, 80% of them live along the coastal city area, blah, blah, blah. We're going to be, visiting these big cities. I said, and there's just so many more people. We'll probably encounter some significant crowds, those kind of things. And then that led into, well, in our house, mom, dad, and the two of you, okay, that's 4 of us. In China, it's not unusual for families to live together, and just based on population, let's say our house was in China, that would be between 16 to 20 people living in our house. And that their eyes got wide, and I was like, oh, okay, that's a reality that we can relate to. So you can also discuss things that kind of tie into general awareness, like who takes care of elderly in China. Usually the elderly parents come and live within the family, home with grandkids and sometimes aunts and uncles. But who takes care of the elderly? Is there a social security system? Well, it's just beginnings kind of thing, or really it's private pension systems that are just now beginning. So, you can kind of delve into some of the social constructs that exist within China that are different. Who takes care of someone who's disabled? How does that play out in society? And that can lead into preparation for, if and when your family on a trip might encounter someone who's begging in the street. If the only time they ever have seen someone who is a beggar, that can be a real, and they don't expect it in any way, shape or form, that can be a real startling, what's the right word? Startling event, which is really burned into their memory. And we also have an article by Dr. Rebecca Nelson that kind of talks about this emotional angle preparation. And she talks about visiting Korea and not at all being prepared for that. And she said, I walked away thinking Korea was a country of beggars, just because it was a startling thing that she hadn't really encountered prior to that trip. So it kind of colored much of the rest of the trip. So you want to do what you can. You can even think back to kind of what was startling to you, or what was, what really stood out. And if any of those things had kind of an unsettling angle to it, then help do some things from a practical standpoint to help your kids prepare. My kids, the school that they go to, there's panhandlers on several corners every time we go and leave. So it's not a total reality adjustment for them. Of course, it is a bit different, but you can talk about some of those different social norms and how disabilities are seen in China versus here. And there's just a whole host, and that certainly could even lead into a school project if you were ending up taking off any time from school, in terms of possibly satisfying some teacher expectations or assignments and so forth. I'm kind of delving off a little bit here. So just think about all aspects, think about what you're going to see. And as you plan your itinerary, get out National Geo, Google Maps, you get out some of these resources, some of these ideas, you'll probably click on some of your own as well. And there's things like, I can send the resource listing out, it's like 2 pages long, but things like National Geo has a video series called Wild China. It's incredibly neat. It's not adoption related, it's just shows some scenery. And that's fun. There's another excellent video series put together by an adoptive dad. Pearl River TV is the name of, I think, his website. And he's done a few documentaries. I mean, this is just kind of his sideline passion. He does other stuff for a living, but shows about rural life in China, even Chinese New Year in Pengwei. And then just kind of some daily documentary experiences. So those are good. The books, Kids Like Me in China, Ying Ying Fry, there's another one. Oh, I can't think of it. And then there's another one called If the World Were a Village of 100. And it's not adoption related, but it's one of my favorites because it takes the whole population of China down, whole population of the world, and says, okay, if it were 100 people in the world, I think 6 would live in North America. I think 1 would have a computer. 3 might have a college education. I think 47 would speak Mandarin. So it provides a really great kind of context for the larger world beyond our neighborhoods and beyond our shores kind of thing. So that can be a really, really powerful thing, which also happens to kind of tie into global mindset. So as you're discussing these things that you will be seeing and doing and looking at, how to make that work for you and become tangible, you want to make sure that you take on a global mindset and don't say, ooh, I hated the pit toilets or the squatty potties or whatever your term is for that toilet experience. And, if you say that and then assign a real negative value to it, your kids kind of unbeknowingly have to choose, well, do I adopt that approach that, my beloved parent is doing, or do I, think it's cool because it's my culture? They just have to make some choices, and it's not a choice you want them to make, even unconsciously or anything like that. So that's something to keep in mind. You can also do things so think positively of both and let them choose. You can do some practical things for, say, the toilet scenario. My kids were young enough. I said, okay, toilets are a little different in China. They're called squatty potties sometimes, and this is how you do it. We're getting, okay, we're in the shower. This is a practice thing. It's no big deal. You bring your own TP. So, just matter of fact, whatever, move on. Especially, at the younger ages, and then let them make their assessment. They may surprise you with some of the things they love, and they will surprise you with pictures they take. Of course, now everybody almost, it seems like, has some kind of electronic device, iPod or phone or whatnot, and can take their own pictures. But even if it's a disposable camera, I highly recommend everybody bring their own camera and take pictures, because your kids will take great pictures and they'll be very different than yours. I've worked as a photographer for a period of time early in my life, or early in my professional life. So I was kind of putting this pressure myself on that trip to like take these great shots of the Great Wall. On the first of the day, it was totally cloudy, etc. But anyway, my kids ended up with some of the best pictures of that entire trip. And it just shows they have a very different viewpoint. And that's incredibly wonderful and just great. Speaking of pictures, this photo is a photo of my oldest daughter, actually, the morning we were leaving her very tiny village, which is 7 hours outside of the capital city. But it was her birthplace, her, what we call her hometown area. And anyway, she'd gotten a hat to keep the sun off of her because it was warm even in late April when we went then. And anyway, it's a fun shot. Trip list. You can just make a list of things you want to do. You can create a photo scavenger hunt, speaking of the photo idea. Who can take the picture of the most loaded down bicycle? Who has the best pic? Let's do these things. So everybody get pictures of, this item, that item, this item, the most, possibly a Buddhist monk, possibly the most packed souvenir shop possible. Just different things that you might think of, even from your trip. The lobby where I first met you at the hotel, or the room number where we stayed at the hotel in the province, and anything like that, and then really personalize it. And if you've seen, there are some great photo albums that have like a top section for a photo and then a bottom, and then I have one that has like 4 lines at the bottom where you can write little notes. I love that format because you can put in pictures of things you do plan to see, off the internet, out of a brochure, whatever, and it can be kind of a preparation tool. Well, we're going to go see this, we're going to see the Great Wall, blah blah blah, we're going to see these items, and then you guys can take pictures of that and then insert it. And then right at the bottom, okay, well, this was pretty much what we were thinking it would be like, or wow, this was so different, and, make little notes. That can be a school tool as they share about their trip, if that's something they want to do. It can be, coffee table item once you get back. Of course, keeping real private information out of it, or in a separate book or whatever. But that can be a nice, fun, real practical thing. Or if your kids are older, they can make their own travel planning book. What do I want to do here? What do I want to learn? Why or why not? Should I visit my orphanage? You can customize this, of course. And in that book, From Home to Homeland, I've actually written a chapter that talks about some of these practical aspects. Parent emotions. You also want to be aware that this might be a real emotional trip for you as well. Sometimes parents get so focused, we're taking care of our kids, we're figuring out what's packing, how many carry-on, how to pack light for 2 weeks in an international country. You're really focused on a lot of these really important logistical considerations. But remember, this trip is a milestone for you as well. And sometimes people get overwhelmed with memories from the adoption trip, or maybe visiting emotional spots if they choose to visit a finding spot. And you don't want your child kind of picking you up out of a puddle, a crying puddle or anything like that, and not really allowing being allowed, so to speak, to have their own emotional needs and space thing going on. So prepare, journal for yourself, or, plan if you want to do something and your child doesn't want to do it, and say you want to go visit the finding spot. If you're traveling with your co-parent, you can arrange a time possibly with the translator and guide to split off for a bit. So just be thoughtful about it. You don't have to just go and be subject to whatever the whim is of the day. Okay, so what to expect? Lots of times people say, well, we have 2 children and can we combine this into one trip? And we say, absolutely. I mean, that is the norm, if you want to say that. And this was an issue in our family, and it's an issue in a lot of families. One place was going to have a much warmer welcome. There's a foster family in my younger daughter's life, and certainly not in my older daughter's life. So that was an issue. So one of the things I suggest you do is kind of draw things around the things you can control. Talk about, we're going to visit your hometown area. You can get on your orphanage Yahoo group and ask, so who has been back? That's usually the most recent sorts of information. Who has been back? Who's been back recently? What was the welcome like? How formal? Was it a cold, perfunctory visit? Did they bring out the firecrackers and the welcome home banner? That kind of thing. And when you say, we're going to visit your hometown area, the focus is less on the orphanage visit, if you choose to include it, which is totally something out of your control. Just accept that. It is really out of your control. There's really limited amount you can do to impact that, but you can have more control over, we're going to visit your hometown, we're going to request to see the orphanage, and we have incredibly strong relationships and have a very high ability to get into even the most difficult ones, and some of the most difficult ones have opened up in the last 3 or 4 years, quite honestly. But even so, if there's, a disparity, sometimes kids will feel that. So I'd say, plan something that's within your power, such as spending a couple hours in the afternoon and going to just peruse the market stalls, or, walk on some country roads or whatever might be of interest right around there, and then just let your child kind of connect to that physical place. Sometimes my kids were young enough, we actually just brought some rocks from our, we kind of had a vacant lot nearby. So we brought some rocks from home and brought those to their hometown, and it ended up, as it turns out, their finding spots where we dropped both of them. Weren't sure about one, really weren't sure about 2, but turned out. Anyway, dropped them off in their hometown area, and then picked up rocks from their hometown and brought those home here, and then made that, part of a shadow box thing that can hang on their walls. So, just think about what you want to do. Sometimes people, I remember one mom, I don't think she traveled with us. She was just speaking at a conference or something, and she said, yeah, I got to the finding spot and I was so focused on my kid. She said, I got there and I'm like, oh, I should have written a poem, I want to light a candle, do all those things. So give some thought to, how you want to structure that. I set it up that we had at least an afternoon in each hometown. One of them a bit more just because of travel, how far it was, but so then that evening, the child got to pick where we could eat and order the menu and some of that kind of stuff. So that can work out that way. Okay, so that's that. The actual orphanage visit, if you choose to include that, these are some of the documents you'll have to have. The process has gone formal. Now there is a filing fee. It goes through CCWA. It's a real, they're getting a bureaucratic stamp in there. They're getting a fee, blah, blah, blah. But the visitation approval requires you identify who the visitors are. You scan in a copy of the adoption certificate, as well as the passport copies of anybody who's going to be included on the visit. In the file, there is typically a police report or a certificate of abandonment, finding ad, and sometimes notes. You can certainly request to view that. Oftentimes it is given, but sometimes it's just something where it's great to just take photos. It's one of those things that Louis Yee, our president, says it's better to ask forgiveness than permission. But that's my interpretation of what he says. He says they won't stop you. If you're looking at the file, you just take photos and they will never come up and say no. But if you ask them, can we have a copy of this, it becomes really official. And then there's really not a national guideline or rule. That doesn't appear to be. So, but the director is very, very hesitant to give any, quote, official documents without approval from higher up. So that seems to work the best in the situation. See, if you have a question on that, you can just pop it into me on the side here for chat. Foster family, birth family, that's usually related to Vietnam, and that's a whole other topic that I won't go into today, but we can discuss privately if someone has questions. But if you have a photograph of the foster family, that's great. The orphanage usually, really restricts visits and that kind of thing between the two, especially during the adoption trip. They're more open for the return trip. But give us whatever contact information you have. This photo is actually my youngest daughter. To the right is her foster mom and her foster mom's sister. So we'll work with you. Generally, we go around the director, or, you know, if it works, go around the director. Sometimes we need to go through them, but whatever you have, we will work with that. Finding site, you can usually visit depending on whatever information you have. Certainly, sometimes they're accurate and sometimes they are not. This is one of those things I suggest to share control. Is your child interested in this, ready for this? That is a whole key component. Certainly let them choose. I generally say, you know, you can plan to visit, put time in your schedule, and then if you decide not to, you can opt not to. If you don't put time in your schedule and you want to, then it becomes, of course, a lot more complicated. Again, parents might wish to, or one parent might wish to, and the child might not. You know, those are things we can work out, you know, with you as you're getting the planning of your detailed trip. Okay, emotional preparation. You know, read and prepare that trip list and reading resource lists. Supporting cultural identity. A lot of the books, Kids Like Me, When You Were Born in China, that's the name of another one I was trying to reference earlier. There's a couple out now. Woohoo Diary is about a mom and her child that went back and spent quite a bit of time. Wuhan. Also plan, you know, around where your child is emotionally, and then make an exit strategy available. Sometimes the finding spot or certain situations. Sometimes Chinese people kind of come up, and especially, you know, like my youngest daughter has these real chipmunk cheeks, want to pinch and talk fluent Mandarin, and she doesn't speak fluent Mandarin. So work out like a code ahead of time, like, Mom, did we bring that yellow umbrella along? And that can mean, get me out of here. And the child doesn't have to say anything that might kind of make them feel awkward around the guide or other people. You know, in a group, if you're with any group of people, you can just kind of put your arm around them, shield them, and say, we're going to go back to the van right now. Or we're going to go back to the hotel, or whatever it might be. So those are some things to consider too. cultural considerations. Prepare your child for the different table manners, privacy and personal space. Privacy and personal space in China are very different than North America. You can, play that out and discuss that. If you look at this plate of food, this is actually my oldest daughter's hometown area, and there is the head of the chicken, the feet of it's a very auspicious chicken. She did order it herself, wasn't quite prepared for how it came, and which was my fault. But we had fun with it. Discuss table manners. Visiting the orphanage director, usually it's customary to take the director and their designees, to lunch. We ask that you pay for it so they don't spend their money on that, because they'll spend too much and don't want orphanage stuff to run short, because they will, really pull out everything to impress a foreigner, whether they have the funds or not. But anyways, so table manners. Smoking is very common in China. It's not considered rude to smoke at the table. Know who sits down first, those kinds of things, which is usually the older, more distinguished. The rules of chopsticks, don't put them upright into the bowl. All those kind of things. Review that, make that part of your fun Friday night, trivia night, China table manners, or your China movie night, and talk about that. I mean, there's a lot of different things you can do to prepare. Sometimes people say, what should I bring? I'd like to bring some stuff. Art and school supplies are actually very, very appreciated, kind of across the board. Vitamins can be very valuable. They're a little more complicated because you don't always know what you're buying. If you're bringing from America, they need to be translated and put into cc's rather than ounces. Both gender gifts. Don't bring all girl clothes. Most of the children that remain in the orphanage are disabled, and you should have conversations with your kids about that. So, because sometimes kids and parents still talk about it as like a baby house. Well, orphanages today are much more significantly filled with older and disabled children. So those are things to consider. This talks about some of the giving back projects we've been involved in. I'll just kind of move on. So what is part of a heritage trip? And I've talked really fast today, but those cultural connections, relationship connections, really with that first community of care, and sometimes just the place and physical connection can be important. And this is me with my 5 and 7-year-old that I just threw in the picture in there. So there is no bad time to go, is what I would say. Maybe unless you're having significant attachment issues with your child, which then, of course, the last thing you want to do is get on a 15-hour airplane flight. But anyway, so just begin and know that we're a resource for you, or I'm a general resource in terms of that initial planning. Louis Yi is our trip planning expert and can go over, preparing a draft itinerary and modifying it. The thing that Lotus Travel probably offers that is a bit different than many or most others is that we are our own travel provider. So we don't have this, well, it has to be this way. And if you vary off that, it's a really incredibly complicated deal. We just make the change. So that, and it tends to be more flexible, pretty cost efficient, and just know who you're traveling with. If you're going with an organization, that's a good thing to ask. Are you the travel provider, or is that subcontracted to somebody else? So I will stay on and just kind of wait for a moment or two. If there is a question, please put that in there, and I will send a link out with those articles that I mentioned to anyone who would like to review and do a bit more reading. And then we will, I guess, wrap it up a little early today. Are there any questions that I can have answered? not seeing any questions, which is fine. Maybe I've answered kind of all the immediate first ones, and if so, we'll wrap up a little early. And I thank you for your time today. We'll conclude there, and you all have a great rest of the day. Thank you.